The party system is an essential instrument of democracy. Wherever government rests upon the popular will, there the party is the organ of expression and the agency of the ultimate power. The party is, moreover, a forerunner of democracy, for parties have everywhere preceded free government. Long before democracy as now understood was anywhere established, long before the American colonies became the United States, England was divided between Tory and Whig. And it was only after centuries of bitter political strife, during which a change of ministry would not infrequently be accompanied by bloodshed or voluntary exile, that England finally emerged with a government deriving its powers from the consent of the governed. Before the Revolution, Tory and Whig were party names used in the colonies to designate in a rough way two ideals of political doctrine. The Tories believed in the supremacy of the executive or the king, the Whigs in the supremacy of Parliament. The Tories, by their rigorous and ruthless acts giving effect to the will of an un-English king, soon drove the Whigs in the colonies to revolt, and by the time of the Stamp Act of 1765, a well-knit party of colonial patriots was organized through committees of correspondence and under the stimulus of local clubs called Sons of Liberty. Within a few years, these patriots became the revolutionists and the Tories became the loyalists. As always happens in a successful revolution, the party of opposition vanished, and when the Peace of 1783 finally put the stamp of reality upon the Declaration of 1776, the Patriot Party had won its cause and had served its day. Immediately thereafter, a new issue, and a very significant one, began to divide the thought of the people. The Articles of Confederation, adopted as a form of government by the states during a lull in the nationalistic fervor, had utterly failed to perform the functions of a national government. The new issue was the formation of a national government that should in reality represent a federal nation, not a collection of touchy states. The Confederation floundered in the slough of inadequacy for several years, however, before the people were sufficiently impressed with the necessity of a federal government. When, finally, through the adroit maneuver of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the Constitutional Convention was called in 1787, the people were in a somewhat chastened mood, and delegates were sent to the convention from all the states except Rhode Island. No sooner had the delegates convened and chosen George Washington as presiding officer than the two opposing sides of opinion were revealed, the nationalist and the particularist, represented by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, as they later termed themselves. The convention, however, was formed of the conservative leaders of the states, and its completed work contained in a large measure, in spite of the great compromises, the ideas of the Federalists. This achievement was made possible by the absence from the convention of the two types of men who were to prove the greatest enemy of the new document when it was presented for popular approval, namely the office holder or politician, who feared that the establishment of a central government would deprive him of his influence, and the popular demagogue, who viewed with suspicion all evidence of organized authority. Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, might for a time unite their energies under the wise chieftainship of Washington, but their political principles could never be merged, and when, finally, Jefferson resigned, he became forthwith the leader of the opposition, not to Washington, but to federalism, as interpreted by Hamilton, John Adams, and Jay. The name anti-federalist lost its aptness after the inauguration of the government. Jefferson and his school were not opposed to a federal government. They were opposed only to its pretensions, to its assumption of centralized power. Their deep faith in popular control is revealed in the name they assumed, Democratic Republican. They were eager to limit the federal power to the glorification of the states. The Federalists were ambitious to expand the federal power at the expense of home rule, or what Americans call local autonomy. Jefferson was a master organizer. At letter writing, the one means of communication in those days, he was a Hercules. His pen never wearied. He soon had a compact party. It included not only most of the anti-federalists, but the small politicians, the tradesmen and artisans who had worked themselves into a ridiculous frenzy over the French Revolution and who despised Washington for his noble neutrality. But more than these, Jefferson won over a number of distinguished men who had worked for the adoption of the Constitution, the ablest of whom was James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution. The Jeffersonians, thus representing largely the debtor and farmer class, led by men of conspicuous abilities, proceeded to batter down the prestige of the Federalists. They declared themselves opposed to large expenditures of public funds, to eager exploitation of government ventures, to the bank and to the navy, which they termed the great beast with the great belly. The Federalists included the commercial and creditor class, and that fine element in American life composed of leading families with whom domination was an instinct, all led, fortunately, by a few idealists of rare intellectual attainments. And with the political stupidity often characteristic of their class, they stumbled from blunder to blunder. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson, who adroitly coined the mistakes of his opponents into political currency for himself, was elected president. When the Jeffersonians came to power, they no longer opposed federal pretensions. They now, by one of those strange veerings often found in American politics, began to give a liberal interpretation to the Constitution, while the Federalists, with equal inconsistency, became strict constructionists. Even Jefferson was ready to sacrifice his theory of strict construction in order to acquire the province of Louisiana. The Jeffersonians now made several concessions to the manufacturers, and with their support linked to that of the agriculturists, Jeffersonian democracy flourished without any potent opposition. The Second War with England lent it a doubtful luster, but the years immediately following the war restored public confidence. Trade flourished on the sea. The frontier was rapidly pushed to the Mississippi and beyond, into the vast empire which Jefferson had purchased. When everyone is busy, no one cares for political issues, especially those based upon philosophical differences. So, Madison and Monroe succeeded to the political regency, which is known as the Virginia dynasty. This complacent epoch culminated in Monroe's era of good feeling, which proved to be only the hush before the tornado. The election of 1824 was indecisive, and the House of Representatives was for a second time called upon to decide the national choice. The candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William H. Crawford. Clay threw his votes to Adams, who was elected, thereby arousing the wrath of Jackson and of the stalwart and irreconcilable frontiersmen who hailed him as their leader. The Adams term merely marked a transition from the old order to the new, from Jeffersonian to Jacksonian democracy. Then was the word Republican dropped from the party name, and Democrat became an appellation of definite and practical significance. By this time, many of the older states had removed the early restrictions upon voting, and the new states carved out of the West had written manhood suffrage into their constitutions. This new democracy flocked to its leader, and Jackson entered his capital in triumph, followed by a motley crowd of frontiersmen, in coonskin caps, farmers in butternut-dyed homespun, and hungry henchmen eager for the spoils. For Jackson had let it be known that he considered his election a mandate by the people to fill the offices with his political adherents. So the Democrats began their new lease of life with an orgy of spoils. Anybody is good enough for any job was the favorite watchword. But underneath this turmoil of desire for office, significant party differences were shaping themselves. Henry Clay, the alluring orator and master of compromise, brought together a coalition of opposing fragments. There soon appeared three practical issues which forced the new alignment. The first was the bank. The charter of the United States Bank was about to expire, and its friends sought a renewal. Jackson believed the bank an enemy of the Republic, as its officers were anti-Jacksonians, and he promptly vetoed the bill extending the charter. The second issue was the tariff. Protection was not new, but Clay adroitly renamed it, calling it the American system. It was popular in the manufacturing towns and in portions of the agricultural communities, but was bitterly opposed by the slave-owning states. A third issue dealt with internal improvements. All parts of the country were feeling the need of better means of communication, especially between the West and the East. Canals and turnpikes were projected in every direction. Clay, whose imagination was fervid, advocated a vast system of canals and roads financed by national aid. But the doctrine of states' rights answered, that the federal government had no power to enter a state, even to spend money on improvements, without the consent of that state, and, at all events, for Clay to espouse was for Jackson to oppose. These were the more important immediate issues of the conflict between Clay's Whigs and Jackson's Democrats, though it must be acknowledged that the personalities of the leaders were quite as much an issue as any of the policies which they espoused. The Whigs, however, proved unequal to the task of unhorsing their foes, and, with two exceptions, the Democrats elected every president from Jackson to Lincoln. The exceptions were William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, both of whom were elected on their war records, and both of whom died soon after their inauguration. Tyler, who as vice president succeeded General Harrison, soon estranged the Whigs, so that the Democratic triumph was in effect continuous over a period of 30 years. Meanwhile, another issue was shaping the destiny of parties and of the nation. It was a topic that politicians dodged and candidates evaded, that all parties avoided, and that presidents and congressmen tried to hide under the thin fabric of their compromises. But it was an issue that persisted in keeping alive, for it was an issue between right and wrong. 3 times the great Clay maneuvered to outflank his opponents over the smoldering fires of the slavery issue, but he died before the repeal of the Missouri Compromise gave the death blow to his loosely gathered coalition. Webster, too, and Calhoun, the other members of that brilliant trinity which represented the genius of constitutional unionism, of states' rights, and of conciliation, passed away before the issue was squarely faced by a new party organized for the purpose of opposing the further expansion of slavery. This new organization, the Republican Party, rapidly assumed form and solidarity. It was composed of Northern Whigs, of anti-slavery Democrats, and of members of several minor groups, such as the Know-Nothing or American Party, the Liberty Party, and included as well some of the despised abolitionists. The vote for Fremont, its first presidential candidate, in 1856, showed it to be a sectional party, confined to the North. But the definite recognition of slavery as an issue by an opposition party had a profound effect upon the Democrats. Their Southern wing now promptly assumed an uncompromising attitude, which, in 1860, split the party into factions. The Southern wing named Breckinridge, the Northern wing named Stephen A. Douglas, while many Democrats, as well as Whigs, took refuge in a third party, calling itself the Constitutional Union, which named John Bell. This division cost the Democrats the election, for, under the unique and inspiring leadership of Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans rallied the anti-slavery forces of the North and won. Slavery not only racked the parties and caused new alignments, it racked and split the Union. It is one of the remarkable phenomena of our political history that the Civil War did not destroy the Democratic Party, though the Southern chieftains of that party utterly lost their cause. The reason is that the party never was as purely a Southern as the Republican was a Northern party. Moreover, the arrogance and blunders of the Republican leaders during the days of Reconstruction helped to keep it alive. There has always been a difference between the two great parties. The Republican Party has been avowedly nationalistic, and until the advent of neoconservatism, imperialistic, and in favor of a vigorous, constructive foreign policy. The Democratic Party has generally accepted the lukewarm international policy of Jefferson and the exaltation of the locality and liberalism as championed by Jackson. Thus, though in a somewhat intangible and variable form, the doctrinal distinctions between Hamilton and Jefferson have survived.